We are coming up on tour stop number 3, the National Memorial Arch. That's the arch in the distance right behind me. But first, we're getting a good look here at what the accommodations would have looked like here at Valley Forge. The huts, as we described before, they would be built mostly of timber, logs, tree trunks that were cut down and smoothed out. And then the chinking in between the logs would have been basically mud and clay. So it probably wasn't the best smelling accommodations you ever heard in your life. As we go in, we've got the fireplace in the far wall, and that would have provided what heat was available. And then two lines of bunks have been taken out, but the hut would have been good to hold 12 men, sleeping quarters for 12 men, in 4 sets of 3 bunks. This cabin only has 2 sets available. The other 2 have been taken out of the corners. But it does give you at least a fair idea of what the sleeping accommodations for the soldiers would have been during the Valley Forge winter. I moved a little bit further down the trail from the one cabin that we just checked out, and here we have another exhibit that shows us a few cabins as they would have looked like in their first stages of development. We have about a row or 2 rows of logs arrayed there, and if we were with the Continental Army in the first couple of days after they marched into Valley Forge, this is what would soon be a city of huts would look like. You can see the little fireplace right there in front of us. We've made it to the Massachusetts Memorial, the second of the state memorials that we encounter here on our tour of Valley Forge. The Massachusetts Memorial honors the soldiers of the Bay State who came with George Washington and camped here at Valley Forge. Inscribed on the monument is the state motto of Massachusetts: Ensi Petit Placidem Sub Libertate Quietem. That's Latin for, by the sword we speak peace, but peace only under liberty. If there are any Latin speakers handy, please correct my pronunciation in the comments section. Now, right by the Massachusetts Monument is this road here called Gulf Road. And that's important because this is the road via which Washington's soldiers reached Valley Forge in December of 1777. From here we can, without too much difficulty, imagine what it must have been like on December 19th, 1777, as Washington's army arrived here on scene. Rather than a modern road, it would have been a dirt farm lane, and it would have been quickly churned up into mud, as the entire camp would be eventually. Now, next to the roadway is this cabin here. Now, right next to the roadway is an older reconstruction of a cabin. A reconstruction that's based on what park historians in the 1950s and 60s used to think that a Valley Forge cabin looked like. Note how it's smaller, and it has windows, which would have been a useless additions for the soldiers to include in their huts. And we have made it all the way up to tour stop number 3, the National Memorial Arch at Valley Forge. The National Memorial Arch was built in 1910, and it was designed by Paul Philippe Cret, who was a professor of arts at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Cret used the triumphal arch of Titus in Rome as his model. The arch is 60 feet tall, and it's easily the largest monument here at Valley Forge. Slightly unusual for monuments, the memorial arch pulls off the neat trick of honoring both the soldiers and the officers who led them of the Continental Army. On the inside wall of the arch, it memorializes all the officers who served in the Continental Army during the encampment at Valley Forge. If you read carefully, we have George Washington there at the top, followed by the men who answered directly to him, the major generals. These were the men who commanded entire divisions in most cases. And under that we have the brigadier generals, the brigade commanders. Now keep your eye on Mifflin up there under the major generals, and Wayne down here under the brigadier generals. We'll be coming back to them very, very shortly. The other wall contains a clip of a speech given by orator Henry Armitt Brown on the 100th anniversary of the encampment. And so this speech was actually given a full 35 years before the arch was built. And here in this place of sacrifice, in this vale of humiliation, in this valley of the shadow of that death out of which the life of America rose, regenerate and free, let us believe with an abiding faith that to them union will seem as dear and liberty as sweet and progress is glorious as they were to our fathers and are to you and me, and that the institutions which have made us happy, persevered by the virtue of our children, shall bless the remotest generation of the time to come. Henry Armitt Brown. Up there above the speech by Mr. Brown, we have the all-seeing eye, the seal on the $1 bill. Oratory is all well and good. Over the years, speechwriters and authors have used every glowing phrase imaginable to praise the soldiers who endured the winter at Valley Forge. But the true authoritative praise, the last word on the courage of the soldiers, comes from none other than the boss, General George Washington himself. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. George Washington was not a fancy orator, and even when he was President of the United States, he never hired a speechwriter. But when he made the point about the courage of his soldiers, he made it about as well as it possibly could be made. We'd be remiss here at the Memorial Arch if we didn't check out the exhibit tables. And this exhibit table here is all about the National Memorial Arch, the building of it, and the restoring of it, and the Freemasons. George Washington, Valley Forge, and Freemasonry represent patriotism, freedom, and brotherly love to all Freemasons. Washington served as the master of his Masonic Lodge at the same time he was President of the United States. Through the preservation of this National Memorial Arch in 1996 through 1997, the Freemasons of Pennsylvania sought to honor the memory of George Washington, a national hero, patriot, and prominent Freemason, and to honor the brave men who endured the winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777-1778. A national treasure. The National Monument Arch was authorized by Congress in 1910 as a tribute to George Washington and his army who endured the winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777-1778. It was designed by Paul Philippe Cret, a prominent Philadelphia architect, and dedicated on June 19, 1917. Although it stood for nearly 80 years as a symbol of triumph achieved by Washington, by the mid-1990s, this arch was in major need of structural repairs, it was cordoned off and closed to the public for safety reasons. During 1996-97, the Freemasons of Pennsylvania contributed more than $1,500,000 necessary to preserve the arch to its original grandeur. And here you have some of the workers hard at work on the inside of the arch. And this is what it would have looked like in 96 and 97. Bad time to visit the arch. You couldn't go through it like we just did. And of course you celebrate when you're done. Now, we just read a little bit about how the Freemasons of Pennsylvania helped foot the bill to restore the National Arch, which is now right there behind us. And so the Freemasons got to put a wonderful monument to themselves and a wonderful flagpole here at the park. In remembrance of the Continental Army led by George Washington, a member of the Masonic fraternity, and in honor of the many Freemasons who were part of the encampment at the site, the Freemasons of Pennsylvania placed this monument so that future generations will know that freedom was as important in 1997 as it was in 1777-78. And that was dedicated in August of 1997. It's probably the most modern monument in the entire park. That will just about wrap up tour stop number 3, the National Memorial Arch. Tour stop number 4 is coming up next. That's going to be the Pennsylvania Columns and the Anthony Wayne statue. Now, to recap what we've done so far, we've started here at the Visitor Center. Then we did the Muhlenberg Brigade. We continued down the road to the National Memorial Arch, stop 3, which we are actually still within sight of. And we're right here now at Wayne's Woods, at this parking lot square right here. There's our parking lot. There's Wayne's Woods. It's foggy enough that you can't really see the arch now. And our next stop is just a few dozen yards down the road here at the Anthony Wayne statue. The Wayne statue is just on the other side of these woods. We go through these Pennsylvania columns and past the woods on the side. The fog has rolled in, but in spite of the fog, you can see that we really haven't gone very far. You can still see the arch looming in the background there. The arch being the largest monument on the entire park by a long shot. But before we check out the Pennsylvania columns and the Wayne statue, we're going to check out these cabins and the New York and New Hampshire memorials. And the first one we come across here is the New Hampshire Memorial. That would make it the third of the state monuments here at Valley Forge Park. And it reads, New Hampshire. This is an appeal to the Honorable Menschich Ware, the chief state official of New Hampshire. And he writes, Sir, duty obligates me to observe to you the present situation of your soldiers. Paint to yourself this, their ragged, suffering condition. They look up to me for relief, and it is not my power to attain them any. This is from General Enoch Poor, who was the brigade commander of these New Hampshire troops. There'll be a brigade marker around here mentioning him. And that's the New Hampshire Memorial. Not far away is the New York Memorial. It's important to remember that most of the soldiers from the state of New York had just fought the Battle of Saratoga in the north, and not all that many of them came to Valley Forge. A lot of them were tied up with the Northern Army in upstate New York, but there were some New York soldiers here. And this relatively subdued monument is to the New York soldiers. No quotation, it is beyond description to conceive what the men suffer. It's from the state of New York, and that quote was from Colonel Philip Van Cortlandt of the 2nd New York Regiment in a letter to George Clinton, who was the governor of New York, from here at Valley Forge. This place on the hillside is close to where the New York and the New Hampshire soldiers made their camps. Again, just like always, you have to mentally get rid of all the trees. It would be a bare hillside and a sloppy, muddy encampment, like it is right now. And we have our 2 cabins that, once again, the doorways form a street with the 2 cabins facing each other. And it's muddy and ugly, just like it would be on any given day here. Once more, we have the doorways facing each other, and once more, that's a bad thing, and we will explain why later on. And here we are at the entrance to Wayne's Woods. These are the Pennsylvania columns behind me. Out of all 13 colonies, Pennsylvania sent the most soldiers here to Valley Forge. Now, while the state monuments from New Hampshire and New York might be subtle and subdued, the Pennsylvania columns are not. They're some of the tallest monuments here in the park, each one capped by a bald eagle. And down here at the panels, there are 4 panels, each panel containing the portraits of 2 generals from Pennsylvania who served at Valley Forge. Here we have John Armstrong, a brigadier general, and Peter Muhlenberg, who we met at tour stop number 2, the Muhlenberg Brigade. Armstrong and Muhlenberg were both brigade commanders from Pennsylvania. Over here we have 2 more Pennsylvanians, the Adjutant General Joseph Reed and William Irvine, a colonel of the 6th Pennsylvania Battalion. We make our way to the other Pennsylvania column. And it introduces us to Arthur St. Clair, who was a major general during the Revolutionary War and stayed in the U.S. Army afterwards and was heavily involved in the Northeast Indian Wars to an almost infamous degree. Also, General John Cadwalader, Brigadier General. Remember his name, because we're probably going to come back to him later on when we talk about the Conway affair. And on this panel, we're introduced to Josiah Harmar, who was a lieutenant colonel, and Major General Thomas Mifflin. There are thousands of stories for the history buff to discover here at Valley Forge. Stories from the soldiers, the officers, the women who followed the army around, the farmers in the surrounding countryside, the opposing British. Here at Valley Forge, on this tour, we're going to look into 4 major stories that helped change the course of history. One is how the Continental Army came dangerously close to starving to death because of a series of administrative failures. We're going to get into that story now, here at the Pennsylvania columns. Other stories involve the training of the Continental Army under Baron von Steuben, the diseases and the sickness that swept through the Continental Army in the last few months of the encampment, and the challenge to George Washington's leadership, which has gone down in history as the Conway Cabal. Here at the Pennsylvania columns, we have the perfect opportunity to discuss the supply situation at Valley Forge. And the reason why is because the early failures of the supply situation here at Valley Forge can be laid at the feet of our friend here, Pennsylvania General, Major General Thomas Mifflin. When the story of the American Revolution is told, Thomas Mifflin takes his place as one of America's founding fathers. He was a decorated war hero. He was a high-ranking general. He was a prominent businessman, and he was a Pennsylvania politician. Thomas Mifflin wore all of these hats with various degrees of success and failure during the American Revolution. By the end of the Revolutionary War, Thomas Mifflin had been the president of the Continental Congress, the job most famously held by John Hancock in 1776. But when the story of Valley Forge is told, it's often the story of a complete breakdown in the supply situation at the beginning of the Valley Forge encampment. And those failures can be laid at the feet of General Thomas Mifflin, who at that time was serving as the quartermaster to the Continental Army. Getting enough food, clothing, and shoes to the Army would have required a smoothly functioning quartermaster department. And George Washington didn't have one. As we mentioned earlier, Thomas Mifflin was a general who wore many hats: politician, businessman, major general. Here at Valley Forge, at the beginning part, he was wearing the hat of quartermaster general, and he didn't wear it very well. Mifflin seems not to have made any of the efforts needed to keep the Army supplied during this winter. Caches of food and supplies were available at the Continental Army depots in Reading and in Lancaster and other Patriot towns. The problem was getting them here to the encampment at Valley Forge. During this winter, there would be never enough wagons, never enough teamsters, and never enough draft animals, like mules and oxen, to ensure regular shipments of goods into the camp. These were all things that Mifflin should have seen to, but evidently never did. The supply situation at Valley Forge was aggravated by the fact that this area of Pennsylvania was no hotbed of Patriot loyalty. The loyalties of the people in this area were very much divided, and the Continental Army did not enjoy universal support. Even farmers and merchants who were patriotic sometimes wanted to sell their food to the British Army, who paid in cold, hard cash, rather than the American Army, which could only pay in continental scrip, which wouldn't be worth anything until and if the Americans won the war. When Washington's army marched into Valley Forge, the food crisis was already being felt. Washington immediately petitioned Congress. He wrote, "Unless some great and capital change takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." The Congress responded by giving Washington emergency powers to confiscate what he needed, to take by force the food that his army needed to survive. Washington despised doing this. He was fully aware that he was in command of an army dedicated to freedom, fighting the forces of a tyrannical King George III. He hated having to resort to a tyrant's tactics. And yet the situation this winter soon became so desperate that the ruthless tactics were the only ones he was left with. Getting the seized food to the camp was the most important job, and Washington gave it to his most important generals. Nathaniel Greene was dispatched to the Brandywine Valley, a well-known nest of Tories and Loyalists. The pragmatic Greene ordered his men to harden their hearts and to feel no sympathy for the king's men that they were about to dispossess. General Anthony Wayne was sent into New Jersey with similarly ruthless intentions to pick clean any Tory farms and warehouses. Up the roadway here, there's a statue to Anthony Wayne, and we'll be able to find out how he did. We have another brigade marker coming up here. The Pennsylvania Division, Anthony Wayne's 2nd Brigade. Now we're on our way to the Anthony Wayne statue. Now it's important. Anthony Wayne has a unique position in the Continental Army hierarchy. Technically, he was only a brigade commander at this point during the Revolutionary War. The brigade commander was technically Thomas Mifflin, who we just spent a little bit of time talking about. The thing is, Thomas Mifflin was kept away from his division so often and so many times and for so long that, as often as not, Anthony Wayne, as senior brigadier, found himself in charge of the entire Pennsylvania line. And George Washington was only too happy to keep it that way. He liked having Wayne in charge of his contingent of Pennsylvania troops. And we're coming up on another reproduction cabin. And another memorial here. We'll read this in a second. We're looking at the ruins of a chimney, which sometimes confuses visitors. These look like they could be authentic ruins, possibly of an actual hut here at Valley Forge, but they're not. Okay, so here's the memorial next to the ruined hut. The quote, ruined hut. And it reads that the hut nearby is built according to Washington's orders for the construction of huts during the winter camp of 1777 to 78. Stands on the site of a familiar hut which sheltered soldiers of the Pennsylvania line and commemorates their fortitude in the endurance of every adversity for their country and for independency. And as we can see, this monument was erected in 1935, and they put the flourishing touches of having the old-fashioned S's look like the letter H. Sorry, the letter F. This is a hut. Those are the ruins of a hut that was built to commemorate. At what time, we're not sure. Very possibly the 30s. That's when they put the memorial up. The National Park Service has given us this hut, much newer hut, as a true representation of what the specifications laid down by George Washington actually were. And they look a great deal like the other huts. Room to fit 12, uncomfortably. Or more if you're an officer. Or more room if you're an officer. And here we are coming up on Anthony Wayne's statue. All right, so we made it to tour stop number 4, the Anthony Wayne statue. There's General Wayne on his horse behind me. Now, it's perhaps surprising that the largest statue here at Valley Forge Park isn't of George Washington. Rather, it's of Brigadier General Anthony Wayne, a brigade commander who often found himself the de facto leader of the entire Pennsylvania division, mostly because Thomas Mifflin was called away on a great number of other duties. So let's get a better look at his statue. Now we're here at the foot of the Anthony Wayne statue, and let's get a better look at the inscriptions. And here I have Anthony Wayne, who was the colonel of the Chester County Battalion of Minutemen in July of 1775, the colonel of the 4th Pennsylvania Infantry in January of 1776, brigadier general of the Continental Army in February 1777 to November of 1783, and brevetted the major general in September 30th, 1783. Resolved unanimously that the thanks of Congress be presented to Brigadier General Wayne for his brave, prudent, and soldierly conduct in the spirited and well-conducted attack on Stony Point, that a gold medal emblematical of this action be struck and presented to Brigadier General Wayne, Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, March 5th, 1792 to December 15th, 1796. And that would be General Wayne's last job. His last job was General Washington's old job as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. We come around this side here. And we have a relief sculpture of the seal of the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is very proud of General Wayne. Here we have more General Wayne credentials here. Chairman of the Chester County Committee, 1774. Deputy to the Provincial Convention, 1774. Member of the Assembly, 1774. Delegate to the Provincial Convention in 1775. Member of the Committee of Safety, 75 to 76. Member of the Council of Censors in 1783. Member of the Pennsylvania Convention to ratify the Constitution, 1787. Born in Chester County, Pennsylvania, January 1st, 1745, and died at Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, December 15th, 1796. Now, it's important to remember that General Wayne was a brigadier general who had the job of a major general, and by the Valley Forge encampment, he was only 32 years old, which is actually pretty young for a major general, and was the youngest of all the major generals here at Valley Forge. And a quote for Wayne at his most famous battle, the attack on Stony Point, New York: "Lead me forward." And here at the foot of the Wayne statue, we have yet another exhibit table. Right next to Wayne's Woods, where the Pennsylvania line would have camped. Right now, as a fixture of the national park, Wayne's Woods is a beautiful picnic area. But it's important to remember yet again that these woods would have been the first things to get chopped down in order to build the huts and to make the cooking fires. So there would have been no trees, no woods at the time of the encampment. And we read, "The 1st and 2nd Pennsylvania Brigades, temporarily commanded by Brigadier General Anthony Wayne, encamped in this area. About 800 men served in each of the 16 brigades at Valley Forge. An estimated 34,577 pounds of meat and 168 barrels of flour per day were needed to feed the army. Soldiers relied on their home states and on the Continental Congress to supply food, clothing, and equipment. Shortages varied widely between the regiments. Any number of misfortunes, spoilage, bad roads, or capture by British foragers could prevent supplies from reaching the camp. When food ran so low that mutiny seemed imminent, General Wayne led an emergency foraging expedition into New Jersey. Their mission was to round up all the cattle they could find and to destroy what they could not bring with them. The owners concealed their herds in pine woods, and there were skirmishes with British foraging parties. But General Wayne was so successful that he became known as the Drover." And here we get a look at General Wayne himself. And here we see the results of his good hard work. Lots of cattle direct from New Jersey coming into Valley Forge, and soon into the bellies of the Continental Army soldiers. General Wayne's statue is oriented so that he's facing his home, which is in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. About 5 miles in that direction. We're going to leave tour stop number 4. Take one last look at General Wayne. And I'm very glad that a lot of the snow melted, because this is an amazing sledding hill for sledders when there's a lot of snow on it. A lot of the snow's melted off today, though, which is why we have this place kind of sort of to ourselves right now, which I'm happy about. We're coming up around the bend here. We're finishing up outer line drive. This is pretty much the end of the outer line. We're about to make a steep right-hand turn into the guts of the park. And we're confronted with this large hill right here. This is called Mount Joy. And Mount Joy anchored the inner defensive line. We're going to get more into that in a minute. First, we're going to check out a couple of monuments that are around the bend on this road. All right, we're in that long stretch that's between tour stops 4 and 5. 5 is George Washington's headquarters. And as we go down this road, we come upon the Virginia Monument, which is right across the street here. We're about to check it out. So far, we've seen monuments from Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York, and Pennsylvania. And here we are at the Virginia Monument. And this marker is placed at the encampment site of the regiments of the Commonwealth of Virginia to commemorate the officers and men of Virginia, which area at that time encompassed what is now the state of West Virginia. These Virginians were wintered here in 1777 to 78 as part of General George Washington's army in the War for American Independence, erected by the Sons of the American Revolution of Virginia. And behind, you have yet another somewhat fanciful representation of a soldier's hut. This is one of the older huts, and it's pretty weirdly inaccurate. This one has not one but 2 sets of windows on each side. And the huts would not have been built quite like that. There would have been no need for windows. Okay, we're coming up to another monument. And this monument is another good example. Well, it's a good example of several things. It's a good example of how history and legend collide here at Valley Forge. And it's also a good lesson into how history always can be and always should be revisited, so that with each review, we get a more accurate picture of what happened at places like Valley Forge and other historical places. The text of the monument is relatively simple. In memory of unknown soldiers buried at Valley Forge, 1776-1778. And of course, erected by the Valley Forge Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1911. We are here at the monument to the unknown soldiers buried at Valley Forge. The text of the monument is relatively simple. In memory of unknown soldiers buried at Valley Forge, 1776-1778. And of course, erected by the Valley Forge Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1911. And this was back at a time when it was widely believed that Valley Forge was actually a mass grave, where the 2,000 soldiers who died during the Valley Forge encampment were buried in thousands of unknown, unmarked graves waiting to be discovered. Historians now believe that that is actually not the case. There are no mass graves here at Valley Forge. It's true that about 2,000 American soldiers died of sickness during the Valley Forge encampment, but these men fell sick and were evacuated to hospitals that were in the area of southeastern Pennsylvania, like Reading and Lancaster and Ephrata and Bethlehem. Yeah. There are few, if any, graves here at Valley Forge, and none of them have been proven. And so this monument was erected with the very best of intentions, and yet it also reflects how imperfect our understanding of history was back in 1911, and might prompt us to wonder how imperfect is our understanding of history today. Although the monument to the unknown soldiers buried at Valley Forge is based on an imperfect understanding of history, it does give us the opportunity to explore who the Continental soldier was during the time at Valley Forge. The myths of Valley Forge, indeed the myths of the entire American Revolution, tells us of the story of a hardy, dedicated volunteer American force, grimly ready to endure any hardship in the fight for freedom. In reality, Washington's army was a mixture of volunteers and draftees. Some of the new American states used the power of conscription to satisfy their quotas, and it was a good thing that they did, for at no time since the signing of the Declaration of Independence did the Continental Army have as many soldiers in it as the British Army in North America did. With states so desperate to put as many men as possible into their militias, it's perhaps not surprising that in many cases there was no such thing as age limits, and if there were, they weren't scrupulously enforced. Many soldiers were in their teens, and sometimes even younger children signed on as fifers and drummers. Supposedly, the youngest here at Valley Forge was 11 years old. On the other hand, there was no upper age limit, as long as a man was healthy and spry. The oldest soldier here at Valley Forge was in his 70s, and he was a veteran of the French and Indian War, which began almost 20 years before the American Revolution did. A great many of these soldiers we're talking about were at or near the poverty level when they enlisted as common soldiers in the Revolutionary War. This is something they had in common with their British counterparts, although not to as great a degree. Many of the young American men who served as soldiers in Washington's army were only close to poverty because they were just starting out in their professional lives. We're talking about apprentices who did not yet have their own businesses, or farmhands who did not yet own their own land, people who were thrown out of whatever line of work they were in because of the war, or because their businesses had been shut down. Others were indentured servants, or even slaves, who enlisted for a chance to gain their freedom or to shorten their terms of servitude. Other people were recently arrived immigrants who had not yet set up shop in their new country. There's another reason why the poor shouldered the brunt of this war, and that was that several of the state laws allowed for rich people to hire substitutes or to otherwise pay their way out of joining the army. There were so many men here at Valley Forge, and they came from so many backgrounds. They had so many stories of how they got into the Continental Army. It should be no surprise that the motivations each soldier had for fighting the war and enduring the privations of Valley Forge were unique to each individual soldier. Some of them indeed were inspired by patriotism or an early 18th century concept of human rights from tyranny. Others fought and marched with the men and boys they had grown up with and had known their entire lives, and for them it simply wouldn't do to be left out. Still, other people had no choice. They were either compelled by law or by a lack of economic options. It's important to remember that primary sources for individual soldiers during the Revolutionary War are extremely limited, and this is because the Revolutionary War was fought at a time when the average soldier could not read or write. Only rarely did soldiers leave memoirs for us to read, such as the very well-educated Joseph Plum Martin, who has a trail here named after him at Valley Forge. We are about halfway between tour stops 4 and 5. We're about halfway to George Washington's headquarters now, but we're going to take a quick stop and detour to check out at least the outside of this house that you can see behind me, General Henry Knox's quarters. Right up there at the hill you can see General Knox's quarters. The exhibit table here is a little hard to get to in the snow. You've got to want it. Here we are. Officers' quarters. In contrast to soldiers' log huts, officers' quarters appear lavish. But the present houses look significantly different from encampment days. Architectural modifications have more than doubled the size of General Henry Knox's quarters. Though a number of officers began the encampment in local farmhouses, many, including Knox, later moved into huts to be closer to their men. So we can get a good look at the building that now stands, and take notice of where the front door is. Right there. Check that front door. All right. Now take a look at the drawing of the house in front of us. In the original house, the door was on the right-hand extreme of the house as it existed in 1771. Everything to the right of that door was added on later. So General Henry Knox did live in this house, but the house was not as big as it is now. And here's General Knox now. We're going to learn more about him at the artillery park. Reluctant hosts. Valley Forge farms were generally prosperous. The area had been cleared and settled since the early 1700s. When the army arrived, many nearby homes and farmhouses were converted to military use. While political loyalties were divided, most civilians simply wished to be left free of the conflict. A good number of officers had their headquarters right here. Henry Knox's quarters are right here. And not far away is William Maxwell's quarters, who was a brigadier general. Lord Stirling, he commanded a whole division. And the Marquis de Lafayette, he was a new general who had not yet been assigned anything. The Marquis de Lafayette had just arrived in America a few months prior, and he had no division assignment yet, but he would soon. 4 generals were housed in this area: Henry Knox, William Maxwell, Lord Stirling, and the Marquis de Lafayette. The house we can only see from the outside. It's not open to the public. So that pretty much wraps it up for this halfway point in between stops 4 and 5.